really my great pleasure and honor to introduce today's first speaker, Dr. Elizabeth Spelke. Dr. Spelke is currently a professor of psychology at Harvard University, and she is one of the pioneers in developmental psychology. She investigates how infants and young children acquire and develop knowledge about the world, such as the knowledge about objects, their quantities, space, and how we understand other people's actions. She identified the connected sources of our unique human achievement by running ingeniously designed behavior experiments with young infants and children. Her research has not only revolutionized the field of developmental psychology and cognitive science, but also has significant impact on multiple disciplines in psychology, including philosophy and computational modeling. So I'm very pleased to have her here today to tell us about how humans develop common sense knowledge. And today she's going to share some thoughts on her research in this direction. So please join me to welcome Dr. Elizabeth Spelke.
Thank you. And thanks to all the organizers. I'm really excited about this day. I can go quickly over the beginning because Fish has really already said this. I think that the first 5 years of human life are a time of incredible feats of learning by young children who come into the world not knowing what particular human culture they're going to be in. And because humans have a way of not only inventing all kinds of belief systems and new kinds of objects for us, but also of radically refashioning the natural world. That means that infants come into, depending on where they're born, they're going to face a very different physical environment, a very different living environment. They're going to face a different social world where people are going to interact with each other in different ways. And they're going to have to learn all of this stuff in order to get along in their world. Now, some of this stuff is learned in school, but the vast majority of it, I think, kids have already essentially mastered before they start school. They've mastered their language, they've mastered the basic symbol systems of their culture, they've mastered the basic belief systems and assumptions and behavior patterns of people in their culture. And they do this without anybody explicitly teaching them anything very much of the time. Even parents who have been indoctrinated that we're supposed to be teaching our young and giving them exciting experiences tend to spend way more time worried about keeping them safe and getting them to sleep than we do with actually teaching them anything. And in many cultures of the world, it's actually considered bad form to be talking to children or teaching them. Children are supposed to learn from observing other people in the ways they interact with one another. And under all of these different circumstances, children learn an enormous amount in the first 5 years. And because cultures differ so much over historical time, because they differ so much today from one location to another, and because they differ not only in their physical characteristics, but in the beliefs that that kids have to master. This is really an incredible feat of learning. So the question then is it possible to build machines that think and learn the way children do over this first 5-year period? I take that to be the topic of the workshop for today. Now, because I always run late on talks, even when I don't have problems with Zoom, I'm going to give you all my conclusions on this slide, so you'll at least have them. The first conclusion is a negative one. I don't think that we can accomplish this task right now, not because of limitations to artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotics, and the efforts that all of you engage in, but because of limitations to developmental psychology. We lack a computational understanding of young children's minds, either of the initial state of those minds in infancy or of the processes by which young children learn. And the reason for that is that developmental psychology has lots of tools for figuring out what children know and don't know at particular points in time. But those tools in themselves don't tell us why they know what they know and not other things, or how they know what they know. For those tools, I think what we need is an interdisciplinary effort. And the reason that I'm excited about this workshop and being here is that all of you are in one of the disciplines that I think is going to be key to answering these problems. But really, there are 3 different disciplines or families of disciplines that I think will be involved. First are all of the behavioral sciences that are in a position to ask, what people know at different ages and in different circumstances in different cultures of the world, what animals know, how the cognitive systems we find in animals relate to those that we find in humans. All of this work is will provide one component of this interdisciplinary effort. Another component, I think, will come from neuroscience, focusing on the brain mechanisms underlying the emergence, development, and use of knowledge, both in humans and in other model animals, where there's hugely rich arrays of methods available. And the third will come from all of you. And my forecast is optimistic. I actually think we can arrive at a computational understanding of children's minds. And by doing so, we'll be getting a better understanding of our own minds, a better understanding of how formal education ought to work, and better abilities to build smarter machines through the kinds of interdisciplinary work that I'm hoping we'll be hearing lots about today. So my roadmap, I'm going to give you exactly one slide in which I talk about core knowledge in general. Then I'm going to plunge into an area that I haven't really given talks on in maybe 10 years, but that I used to work on a lot. Looking at what children know at different ages about the layouts through which they navigate, through which they plan acts of navigation, recover their own sense of where they are, and learn about the positions of objects and other features of the environment. I'll spend almost all of my time on that. Then I'll spend one more slide focusing on what young children don't know about the navigable environment, and asking, what ways do children have of gaining new knowledge that carries us beyond other animals and allows us to learn about further things about our environment fast and flexibly? And then I want to end with two suggestions about some possible mechanisms. One focused on mechanisms that might produce core knowledge in inexperienced infants and animals, and the other focused on mechanisms by which children, only humans, children and adults actually, can gain new concepts through a fast and flexible learning process that's available only to us. So that's where I'm going if time permits. Here's my one slide on core knowledge. When we do studies primarily of infants, what we learn is that there's very little that they know, but they seem to have pockets of knowledge about entities in different domains. They know something about the places in the world that they can move to. They know something about objects and the ways in which objects move and interact with each other. They know something about other people and the ways in which people can communicate with each other, share experiences, and engage both among themselves and with the infant. They also know something about people and animals as agents who cause their own motions, act on things in the world, direct their actions to goal objects, and act on them efficiently. They know something about the kinds of things that populate the world. My current hunch is that this is a system that primarily evolved to capture the properties of living kinds, but it's clear that if you follow its development in children, as people like Linda Smith here have done in beautiful research on kids over the first couple of years, you see that it comes to be a system for dealing with the forms and functions of artifact objects primarily. And finally, a system of number whose dedicated function really isn't clear because number is such an abstract and general property of the world, but that I think many of us believe is used primarily to allow children to learn about the statistical properties of objects and events in any of the other domains about which they have knowledge. Now, each of these systems focuses on a different domain of entities, and each of them captures a different set of properties about the world, but all of these systems have some interesting properties in common. First of all of them center on abstract, interconnected concepts, and here, while I keep talking, are some of the key abstract concepts that are represented by infants as they engage with entities in each of these different domains. Second, each of the systems are radically limited, and in particular, they're blind to just about all of the perceptible properties of entities within a domain. So for example, to take just the agent system, infants, when they see a person acting on an object, they infer that that person has these abstract properties. They've got causal powers. They're minimizing the cost of their actions. They're directing their actions to to create valued end states, but they know essentially nothing about what it is the person is doing. Even when a person engages in the most familiar actions that babies see all the time of picking up objects, babies have no idea what picking up an object involves, or why that person is doing that, or if they even want that object, or how it is that they're getting it into the air. So they seem to be quite blind to even the most familiar perceptible properties of the entities in their domains, at least when we test them early enough. Now, each of these systems emerges early. It begins to function early in life, and it remains functional throughout life. So these systems are not scaffolding that are there just to get learning off the ground. Rather, we continue to have them and continue to use them in much the same way that infants do throughout our lives. The systems are unconscious and modular and resource limited. The best evidence for this comes from studies of adults that find those systems in us using either methods from neuroscience or behavioral signatures of those systems, and then ask people, what do you think is going on while people are using these systems? And we don't actually have immediate introspective access to the representations that these systems are forming. Now, when people are studied through the mechanisms of systems and the methods of systems and cognitive neuroscience, we find that these systems activate homologous brain areas in infants, children, and adults, and also in animals when comparative studies are done on these systems. And together, that evidence, together with evidence from behavioral studies of animals, suggests that these systems are ancient, that they evolved in ancestors that we share with other animals, and that they're instantiated in mechanisms with the same computational properties in us and in other animals as well. Now, if that's true, it means we can use other animals as model systems for studying the development of these cognitive systems. And when we do that, we get evidence in the cases where it's been studied that these systems are innate. And when I say they're innate, I'm not making some magical claim about their falling out of the sky. I'm simply saying that these systems are present and functional the first time that an infant animal encounters an entity in that domain. So the first time they're actually being used to track an entity in that domain, they're already present and functional. And the evidence for this comes from studies using controlled rearing methods in animals. It's hard to get evidence for innateness from studies of human infants, ethically and also practically. And then finally, both in humans and in other animals, the primary function of these systems seems to be to support learning all of the stuff that these systems don't specify about the particular properties of the environments that an animal finds itself in, or that an infant finds himself in, and also in the case of humans only, learning that allows us to develop whole new concepts and systems of knowledge. So those are the general properties of these systems. I decided to talk about places today because I was missing them. I haven't talked about them in a while. And also because the place system, I think, gives rise to the simplest representations of any of these systems of core knowledge. So I think it may be a really good one to be thinking about in the context of this project of trying to reverse engineer infant minds and build smart machines. And finally, I wanted to talk about places because all of the other systems are quite most of the research on the other systems involves very young infants, but I'm kind of inspired by the fact that a lot of the talks today are going to be focused on toddlers, and toddlers are the rock stars of human work on place representations. So it gives me a chance to talk about them here. Now, to do so, I have to go way back in history to the 1980s when I first appeared at Cornell and met a wonderful graduate student, Linda Hermer, who I sadly have lost track of and couldn't find any recent photos of or much information about. But at the time, she came to me with an interest in spatial cognition and also in human uniqueness. And I had just arrived at Cornell from Penn, where my colleague Randy Gallistel and a wonderful graduate student, Ken Cheng, had been doing studies of rats that suggested that animals navigate in a very different way from anything that seemed intuitive to me as a human. If they were hungry and had been shown that food was hidden in, let's say, this upper right corner of a rectangular chamber, and then they were taken out of the chamber, spun around so that they were disoriented, and the food was removed and the floor was swept over, then, and they were put back in the chamber, they tended to search for that food in two locations: the actual location where it had previously been buried, and the geometrically equivalent opposite side of the room. Now, Cheng and Gallistel worked very hard to try to get rats away from this strategy by putting distinctive patterns at the different corners, the two geometrically equivalent corners, by putting different smells there, by making one of the walls very different in brightness from all of the others, using all information that we know that rats can detect. Yet in these experiments, they didn't use any of that information. They just used the shape of the room. So I was sure that young children wouldn't do this. So we created a rectangular room. We brought children in with a parent and a favorite toy from home, hid the toy in one corner of the room, had the parent pick the child up, spin the child around until she was disoriented, and then put her down facing one of the four walls of the room, different ones on every trial, and encouraged her to go find her toy. And to my surprise, kids went to the correct corner much more often than they went to either of the two corners that were adjacent to it. So they seem to be able to distinguish. There's lots of evidence that kids have problems with left and right, but they seem to be able to distinguish the corner that was left of the red wall from the one that was right of the red wall. However, they only went to the correct corner about half the time, and they went equally often to the opposite corner, just like the rats did. This was a big surprise to us, so lots of experiments followed in my lab and other labs to try to see if we could make this effect go away. We thought maybe kids just aren't interested in walls. Let's put some nice toys in the room that'll distinguish one corner from the other, so they'll go to the corner that's near the truck. They didn't do that. Then Francis Wang, now at Illinois, joined the lab and thought maybe we should take away some of that informative geometry. Let's make a square room, and let's make the colored wall really jazzy sateen wall. That didn't work either. Then she thought, let's give that wall some function. So she brought toddlers into the lab every day for a week. And all week they played a music game where they'd go into this room and be spun around till they were disoriented. And then if they banged on the red wall, it activated a recording of some music. So kids loved this. They played this game. And on the fifth day after playing it, they brought a toy from home that was hidden in a corner of the room, and they went equally to the four corners. There were some kids who even liked the music game better than their toy from home. So when they were told to get the toy, first they went and banged on the wall. Then they went to get the toy, searching in a corner in the wrong relationship to the wall that they had just banged on. So it looks in all of these studies as if kids are robustly only using geometric properties of the room. In this case, it looks like the corners, in order to navigate. So this system doesn't seem to care about surface colors or about objects like a truck or about functional properties of the surfaces. It just seems to depend on some properties of the shape of the room. And that raised the question, what shape properties are governing navigation, both for the children, and actually that's a question one can raise for the rat work at that time as well. Now, the work that started addressing this question happened after two wonderful events occurred. The first was that I moved to Harvard, and as part of my move, I was able to get a lab in which they constructed a fully symmetrical circular cone-shaped room. There were curved panel walls. There was a hidden spring-operated door. So when you were in this room, you really had, it was very bizarre because there were no cues there that could tell you which way was which when you were inside this room. So it made it much easier for us to conduct studies asking what are the conditions under which, what kinds of geometry and what kinds of entities are being represented by the system. But the even more wonderful thing that happened when I moved to Harvard was that Sang Ali, then a graduate student in astrophysics in California somewhere, decided that as interesting as the spatial nature of the universe was, she was even more interested in the human mind and our human conceptions of the spatial nature of the universe. So she came to Cornell and did just about all the studies that I'll talk about from now on. So the studies were all done in this uniform room. But because this room had no identifying features that you could use for reorientation, we were able to take the rectangular rooms apart and ask what kinds of information are kids reorienting by. So my first bet was they would be using the lengths of the walls. So Sangha put pairs of walls of the lengths of what had been the original rectangular room, equidistant from the center of the room. And we learned that I was wrong. Kids don't use this information. They don't use it when objects are hidden at corners. They don't use it when they're hidden in the middle of a wall. They respond equally regardless of whether the wall is long or short. My next intuition was, well, maybe it's the overall rectangular shape, which would be best conveyed by the corners. That turned out not to be right either. And then the third idea was maybe it's the extended surfaces themselves. And that was the only condition in which children succeeded in reorienting themselves by the geometry of this layout. So with that information, we then went on to ask, okay, in these studies so far, we've presented freestanding walls, but they were taller than the child, so they were barriers to vision and to locomotion. What if we lower the walls so the child can see over them but not walk over them? It still worked. Then we asked, well, what if we lower the walls further so they can even step over them? That still worked. And finally, at the end of the day, here is where Sangha ended up in 4 experiments. Starting with the one on the left. She presented walls that were 2 centimeters high. Children used them to reorient in this room. Then she thought, let's take away the discontinuities that you get when you have this little picture frame-like structure on the ground by presenting, in effect, speed bumps in a rectangular configuration of hiding locations. And again, children succeeded at reorienting by that information. But when she went to a fully flat black rectangular surface on the floor, children did something really interesting. They showed that they detected and used the surface because they only searched at its corners. If they were completely blind to it, they would have searched anywhere on a virtual circle at about the right distance from the center of the room and from the bounding walls of the room. They didn't do that. They only searched at corners. But they didn't use the shape of this rectangular surface to distinguish the 2 geometrically appropriate corners from the other corners. Now, there was one other difference in this condition, which is that when the rectangle was completely flat, there was no impediment to children's locomotion. So the last study that Sangha ran created an impediment that was at least as big as the impediments to motion in the first 2 conditions that were successful. She put 4 columns in the room. She took twine and she connected that. She used the twine to connect the columns at about the child's ankle height, and called the children's attention to that twine so that they didn't trip and try to leave the room. Now, this effectively confined the kids to the rectangular space that the twine enclosed, yet they didn't use that information to reorient. It wasn't part of the ground surface, and they simply went to a column irrespective of the geometric properties of the columns. So this suggests that you don't need walls. It's not only in enclosed environments that we're able to navigate, and children are able to navigate, also in open environments. But it left open the possibility that when you're in enclosed environments, there still will be useful information. And this was tested in my favorite experiment in this series, favorite recent experiment by Qingfen Hu at Beijing Normal University. So she presented children with a rectangular room that had a sloping ceiling and hid an object in one corner of that room. Now here, there's multiple sources of information distinguishing that corner from the opposite corner. You've got a high ceiling in the opposite corner, a low ceiling here. You've got a wall that's twice as big in the opposite corner from the wall here. You've got 2 side walls of contrasting shape. All of that could be distinguishing this corner from from the opposite corner, yet kids searched at those 2 corners equally. So the conclusion I draw from all this is that toddlers reorient by distances and directions of 3D perturbations in exactly one surface, the ground surface over which we navigate. And they don't reorient by walls, by ceilings, or by markings anywhere, including markings on the ground surface, as in Sang-A's experiments that I just described. But there's counter evidence to this claim that I'm going to present because I think it reveals another important property of all core knowledge systems. Here's the counter evidence. It comes from experiments by Jane Ellen Huttenlocher and Stella Lourenco, where they used the same reorientation task in rooms that were square, but that had patterning on the surfaces. And in one condition, they showed that if you put circles on two of the opposite surfaces and crosses on the other two surfaces, kids don't use that pattern information. They'll search at all four corners, as in the studies that Sang-A did and others did earlier. Now, they also don't, children also don't distinguish the two correct, commonly patterned surfaces from the other two surfaces when they're presented with circles versus homogeneous walls. However, when they were presented with large circles versus small circles, now they can find their search to the correct location and the opposite location, which had the same relations between large and small circles. Now, initially, this was really puzzling to us. How could it be that you could navigate by large circles relative to small, but not by large circles relative to nothing? It seemed like they were failing an easy task and solving a harder one. But the answer, I think, is revealing. And you might get a sense of it if you think about what a corner of this room would look like. Now, if you're standing far enough away or you close one eye, then this pattern of large, sparse versus small, dense circles it serves as a cue to depth. You will see the surface that has large circles as being a little bit closer to you than the surface that has small, dense circles. It's the depth cue of relative size. And that raised the possibility that this surface patterning was not influencing the reorientation system. It was influencing a system that serves as input to that system by which we perceive depth. So the last study I want to tell you about tested this possibility. This again is work by Sang-A Lee and Nathan Winkler Rhodes. They took, in the first step of this work, they presented babies with toddlers with slightly rectangular surfaces and found the smallest degree of rectangularity that the toddlers could reliably detect. And then they did the key experiments, which were to take a room intermediate between the one that they robustly detected and the one that they clearly failed to detect. They took an intermediate, very slightly rectangular room and ran kids in two conditions. In one condition, they put the big circles on the closer walls of that room, and in the other condition on the farther walls. The idea being that if these were serving as a depth cue, we'd see a difference between these conditions, and that's in fact what they found. So the conclusion from this is that the mechanisms for perceiving depth are providing input to the system by which kids navigate. Okay, so don't build navigation systems directly on images. Through a direct analysis of pixels. There's an intermediate representation here of visible surface distances. So machines with core knowledge are going to need perceptual systems as well. And by the way, I'm illustrating this this point here, but there's very similar evidence for the same point from studies looking at core knowledge of objects, where what matters for representing and tracking objects are not image displacement in a two-dimensional array, but actual movement of bodies in three-dimensional space. And you only see success under conditions where there's perceptual information that allows the infant's visual system to detect that. Now, this work also shows that core knowledge is extremely limited because the core system itself is only caring about the ground surface, doesn't care anything about any of the other properties that other systems within the same infant's mind, like in this case, the visual system, does care about and is processing. And finally, I think it suggests that core knowledge of space is highly abstract and general. Depending on where people live, they may be navigating over grassy surfaces or rocky surfaces or sandy surfaces or man-made floors of all different sorts. But everywhere, no matter where you live, as you navigate, features of the surface that you're navigating on are not going to move, and your own distance and direction from those surfaces will change in exactly the same ways as you move around, in accord with basic principles of geometry. Those are the kinds of principles that core knowledge systems capture. So I've talked about these first two properties of core systems. How much time do I have, Fish? I suppose I should be able to look. Probably not much, right?
10 minutes left.
10 minutes? Oh, great. Okay. So what I want to do now is spend 5 of those minutes telling you about the other 4 properties. And I want to do so by appealing to work that I hope I can go very quickly over, because it should be familiar to all of you. It's won Nobel Prizes. It's a very famous work on the neuromechanisms of navigation. So this is the star players in this work are rats. The star experimenters are John O'Keefe and his former students and colleagues, including the Mosers in Norway. And as I think everybody knows, when you study adult rats, not disoriented, oriented, and freely exploring an environment, you find individual pyramidal neurons in their hippocampus that activate when the rat moves through a particular position in space. Different neurons activating for different positions in space. Now, starting in the 90s, O'Keefe and his first student, now wonderful investigator, Neil Burgess, started asking questions really similar to what we were asking about navigating toddlers, about what kinds of information do place cells care about. So they did experiments where they started playing with the walls of a room, and they discovered some interesting things. So one thing they discovered, oops, let me turn that off. One thing they discovered is that place cells don't, like toddlers, don't care about the overall shape of the room. When they presented 2 rooms of the same shape but different size, the place fields didn't scale up to maintain size invariance. Instead, they seem to care only about individual walls. So this place cell seems to care most about the north wall, a fair amount also about the west wall, less, though to some degree, about the east wall, and as far as we can see, not at all about the south wall, regardless of whether it's close or far away. You see very similar patterns. And different place cells seem to care most about different walls, but always it was these individual walls. So it looks like for the place cells as well, what's mattering is distance and direction, not shape. They went on to ask, do place cells care about corners? And they asked that by taking a square room, mapping out where the place fields were, and then altering the room to remove the corners, kind of smooth them over. So it started becoming progressively more and more like a spherical room instead of a square. They discovered that taking away the corners didn't influence place cell firing at all, until the room had become so circular that there were no longer flat walls there. Then you saw a radical remapping of the place cells, but otherwise they didn't seem to care about corners. They also didn't care about object surface color or texture. If you mapped the place, when they mapped the place fields in a tan wooden room and then tested the rat in a room with metallic, that was entirely metallic, you see the same firing that you had seen in the other room. And then, of course, people have studied other cells surrounding the place cells, including head direction cells, which fire anywhere in an environment, but only when an animal is facing in a particular direction, and grid cells, which tile the layout in these beautiful hexagonal patterns, and found that these cells as well were modulated by changes in the spacing of the walls of a room, but not by other kinds of features, like whether there were objects in the room, whether those objects moved from one place to another. A particularly interesting set of cells that different labs either call border cells or boundary vector cells, also fired in multiple locations, but like those place cells that preferred one wall to another, only when the animal was standing at a particular distance and direction from a large extended surface, not when they were standing near objects. So this made it look like these cells were focused on walls, not objects, until one of the people in a group of people in Colin Lever's lab discovered that actually you didn't need walls to elicit these responses. They did a pair of experiments where first they took a platform, surrounded it by a wall, and mapped out what the border cells, how border cells fired with that platform there. Then they removed the wall. So they only had the platform and then a drop off, okay? The same border cells that had fired to the walls fired to the drop off, okay? So it looks like it's not actually the walls that are mattering at all, it's just the ground surface. So not walls, not objects. Then they asked, how subtle a discontinuity, a drop-off between two walls will the rats care about? Suppose those are so small that they can easily walk over them. And now they got results that look like Sangha's results with human toddlers, where you take a border cell, and if there are tiny gaps between different parts of the surface, the rat will very smoothly walk across those three surfaces with the gaps. But as it does so, the border cells are firing to indicate every one of those discontinuities. So it looks like this whole system is sensitive only to the ground surface and its subtle 3D perturbations. Now, here we see all of these similarities between rats and humans, toddlers versus adult rats, testing in a state of disorientation versus oriented animals. It looks like we're dealing with a common system here that operates in quite a general way on a very, very limited set of information about the environment. But the nice thing about the experiments in neuroscience is they can go on to ask questions that I don't know how to ask with behavioral methods. And here are a few of the things that they found. Very early on, they found out that the system is active in darkness as well as in the light. It's active only during active motion, not passive motion. If you pick a rat up and move them through one of these environments, the play cells are silent. But there are other conditions under which these cells are active when rats are not moving. If they've explored an environment during the day, they may dream about it at night. If they're performing a series of tasks with rest periods in between, they may reactivate the paths that they took in the previous session, or they may anticipate the paths that they're going to be getting in the next session, so-called replay and pre-play. And in my favorite studies, they've shown that rats will simulate paths that they've never taken in an environment. In these studies, there's a large maze, but barriers are placed in it so that on alternating days, the rats can explore either one half or the other half, but never both halves together. But when they look at replay, they see the rats simulating paths that connect the two things that they've never directly traversed together. So it looks like what's activating the system are acts of action planning that result in simulations of layouts and paths through those layouts that the rat is not currently experiencing. Now, this is all work on rats, but there's beautiful parallel work that's been done, enlightened by these findings, showing evidence for grid cells in humans, evidence for the same kinds of reorientation processes, dissociating use of a beacon from navigation, maintaining one's own sense of place, and evidence for simulation processes in humans who solve spatial tasks and abstract non-spatial tasks with properties very like the properties found in rats. The interesting thing about finding them in humans is that when you see that during a rest period, people have actually simulated a path of motion, you can ask them, what were you thinking about during the rest period? Were you thinking about that task? And the answer typically is no, I wasn't, okay? This is not some conscious, deliberate process. It's an automatic process that we engage in when we're dealing with new tasks, and a process that very likely aids our learning and efficient performance of those tasks. So I was going to go on, but I'm clearly out of time, so I'm not going to tell you about early emergence and innateness. They're beautiful studies of baby rats. I recommend them to you if you haven't seen them. They established that this system emerges early in rats. They don't establish that it's innate because 2 days pass between when rats first open their eyes and when they first start exploring, which is the first time that you can actually activate any of this system. But there have also been behavioral studies of chicks who have all of the behavioral signatures of the same system that we find in infants, showing that a chick controlled reared so they never get to see a geometrically informative environment will use the geometry of the environment the first time that they're disoriented within it to recover their sense of orientation. So behavioral work, at least, has already indicated that these systems are functional on first encounter, when the very first time that they're needed. They aren't shaped by experiences of trying and failing to use this information. They're already present and ready to go. So I think these properties are true of all of the systems of core knowledge. I do want to flag, though, that some of the evidence is so far lacking. So if you're interested in agents, I should warn you that the work that's been done on abstract notions of agents has all been done quite recently. None of it has yet been done on other animals. So we have no evidence from controlled rearing about what goes on in the first 3 months of life. We know that these representations are present and functional at 3 months of age, but we don't know earlier. We've been studying object representations for a long time, but we still don't know where these representations are in the brain. And because we don't know that, we don't know how to find these representations in an adult mind and track whether they're still there when we're doing fancier other things. So we don't really know much about whether these are guiding children's uniquely human learning. There's some questions that are still open about that. So in that state of partial knowledge, I want to just end by asking 2 more questions and giving you quick suggestions as to answers. The first question is, if these core knowledge systems are innate, how might they function? How might they come to be in fetal minds? And the second question is, if these systems are foundations for learning, then how might children use them to go beyond their limits and develop new systems of concepts and systems of knowledge that are unique to our species? So for my suggestion about the first thing, how might inexperienced minds grow core knowledge? I wonder if there could be a role for mental simulation in fetal development. Given that inexperienced animals can simulate routes that they've never taken, could a completely inexperienced fetus be endowed with a capacity to simulate environments, simulate objects, and by doing so, prepare other systems in the cortex, like recognition systems, for encountering the entities with the abstract properties that those simulations exhibit, and thereby learn about the more concrete properties of those objects once they experience them for the first time outside the womb. Now, this is something for which we have no evidence whatsoever, but I think it's worth exploring for a couple of reasons. One is that if there were something like a generative model that Darwin gave developing fetal animals, including us, for generating patterns of activation that capture movements through a layout or objects or agents and actions on things in the world, then this could explain why what we see when we test young infants or other animals is sensitivity to abstract properties of the world, but not concrete perceptible properties of the world. Those things would have to, would not be specified by these models, and they would have to be learned by the recognition systems that are searching for these models postnatally as the child actually enters the world and starts learning. Now, this kind of mechanism could also explain why we're completely unaware of the fact that when we establish our sense of place, we're only using the ground surface we're walking on, right? I mean, it's like the last thing we would think about intuitively. But if we think that core knowledge takes the form of generative models that simply generate things that have these properties, doesn't take the form of like symbolic rules that say, pay attention to the ground while you're navigating, that could maybe explain the character of the cognitive systems that seem to be at work here. And finally, I think this is a testable prediction. Studies using functional brain imaging applied to infants should be able to test it. Okay, I was going to go on and talk about how we go beyond these systems by combining them and how we use language to do that, but I'm clearly completely out of time. So let me just end by saying that where on this story might we think machines would need to go in order to develop the common sense learning of toddlers. First of all, I'd like to see us build core knowledge into those machines. Second, I think we need to build perceptual systems into those machines so they get the right kinds of input to systems of core knowledge. And third, I didn't get a chance to talk about this, but if these systems are going to allow children to discover new concepts by combining information from core knowledge and using language, both the language they themselves have learned and the language they've heard other people speaking, guiding them to what the relevant combined concepts are, we need a system that can interact with people, learn from their language, and from that start combining concepts in the ways that humans do. But maybe we could come back to some of that in the discussion or later in this workshop. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the great talk. So now we will move to QA. I will pick maybe like 2 questions here. Okay, our first one is Chris Atkinson. I will allow you to talk.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Chris.
Okay, there are 2 parts to this question that basically boil down to, are your stimuli in the experiments ecological? And the second is, how does this relate to, all the stuff we learn about Piaget and occluded objects essentially cease to exist for infants?
I should have talked about objects.
Yeah.
Occluded objects don't cease to exist for infants. Infants, though, are radically limited in their capacities for action planning. And actually, Piaget's experiments are the most beautiful demonstration of that. The same Piagetian infant who fails to remove a screen to reveal an object behind it will also fail to pull on a blanket on which an object that's perfectly visible is sitting, okay, to bring that object within reach. Now, both of those actions require planning a 2-step action, right? You have to act on one thing in order to create the conditions in which you can do something else. And babies are bad at that. But there's lots of evidence that when objects are hidden, both human infants and other animals, infant animals of all sorts, represent those objects. They track them over time. They expect them to move on continuous paths. They expect them not to pass through other objects and so forth. There's a whole literature on that. Piaget discovered really important phenomena, but the phenomena are in the domain of attention, working memory, executive function, action planning, not object representation.
So back to the ecological part.
Okay.
When I look out my window, I don't see rectangles. I see incredibly rich scenes. And the second issue is, if I want an infant to go somewhere, I put an object there that they want and that they can directly perceive. It's sort of, as you said at the beginning of your talk doesn't make any sense. It's inconceivable to me that significant features like the big tree or the stream that has water don't dominate decisions as to how I navigate and where I go.
Yeah, no, they don't. And actually, it no longer seems to me as if they should. The problem with big trees is that different big trees look an awful lot like each other, okay? So if you mark that your home is near, you're going off into the forest and your home is in the forest, okay? And it's near a big oak tree. And now you're wandering away and you are representing where you are remembering that your home is near a big oak tree. I submit you will not get back home. But if, as you're going out, you're engaging in path integration and you're keeping a representation of the distance and direction of your home, then you will get home. And a rich literature on navigation in animals and a slightly less rich but still present literature on path integration and navigation in humans shows that that's how we do it, not by using things like trees. Of course, natural environments have lots more in them besides the ground surface. They've got trees, they've got cliffs, they've got caves that you can enter. But that information seems not to be used for purposes of navigation by any animal that's been studied by any method that I've been able to see. Now, of course, maintaining our sense of place is not the only thing that we have to do. We also have to learn about particular kinds of objects and their relations to each other. And I gave you plenty of cases where babies seem to learn about that, where toddlers. So they learn that a key object that they're looking for is located in a particular column, or it's located at a particular corner of a flat black mark, black rectangle on the floor. They don't navigate by that information, but they do represent that information. That's really important. The place system is only one part of core cognition, and there's many other parts that other systems will be representing. And in part because the environment is so much richer than what anybody is presenting to a rat in a study of place cells or to a kid in a study of reorientation. I see a hand. No?
Well, I think we're actually a bit out of time, so we better move on. But thanks very much, Elizabeth.
Oh, please use the raise hand to just give applause to Elizabeth.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, people raising hands. Okay, so we will move on to the next session. So Adam, I will give it to you.